Now, more than a third of South African children under the age of 17 suffer emotional abuse and neglect. Now, this could result in invisible scars that could put them at greater risk of mental illness and limit their chances of fulfilling a functional adult life. Now, let's discuss this further. We're joined now by Dr Eugene Allers, who is a member of the South African Society of Psychiatrists. Now, thank you so much, Eugene, for joining us. Physical and sexual abuse, we always see this in the courts and in the headlines. But physical or psychological abuse, rather, it doesn't get the attention it needs. Why is it so important for us to shine a bigger spotlight on this issue?
Because emotional and psychological abuse is in actual fact more detrimental to a child than physical or sexual abuse. If we look at odds ratios, and there's been good research done to see what are the odds of somebody developing a mental illness or a psychological problem later in life, it seems to us that the statistics show that it's about 4 times more likely to develop an emotional or psychiatric problem later in life if you've been emotionally abused, 4 times more so than physical or sexual abuse. So it's even worse than sexual abuse, and it doesn't get that sort of attention, strangely enough.
And of course, talking about, sexual abuse and physical abuse, that is also worrisome because emotional abuse entails, or physical and abuse can also lead to emotional ramifications. And that too contributes to this issue.
Yes, and in South African statistics, it's shown that about 27% of children are victims of multiple abuses. That means emotional, physical, sexual. That's a quarter of South African children. So that is massive. A third are emotionally abused. 70% report some sort of abuse before the age of 18 or 17. So it's a high statistic. So that is a major problem. The other problem is, of course, when kids are abused, or people that have been abused, often develop problems themselves and become abusers. So with our whole approach in terms of ending violence against women and children, it's important that we also start asking, how are we going to stop this? At the end of the scale, clearly one has to put people in jail that abuse. And but one should also ask, how can we start preventing this problem? And it probably starts at home with kids that have been abused anyway, because most of them then become abusers. So that's something that really seriously needs attention in future, because if we want to stop this wave of violence in South Africa, it's really, really important that we start looking at the whole picture, not just the end of it, which is also worrisome, but also at the start. Where do all these things start?
Now, what are some of the telltale signs when we want to see, or know when a child is being emotionally abused? What are some of those signs to look out for?
Emotional abuse is obviously very difficult because there's no single event or events that one can define. It's much more a chronic problem. But if a child changes behavior, poor performance at school, they start isolating themselves either on the one end or on the other end, they could be becoming aggressive, violent, agitated, but often they're also anxious. And one of the major symptoms of children that have been abused is anxiety. So if you find a child's been too anxious or very anxious or suddenly become anxious, it is obviously related to that. It could be related to abuse, and it is something that needs to be investigated.
Would you say there is a lack of knowledge, when it comes to emotional abuse in children especially, and what can be done to educate people about this, especially taking a look at, a lot of our communities where this sort of abuse does take place?
That's why SASOP feels that it is important that we start highlighting this form of abuse as well, because it is so absolutely detrimental. Often sexual abuse and physical abuse hit the headlines, which is rightfully so, but there's no or very little reporting on emotional abuse or even studies on emotional abuse in South Africa, or it doesn't get spoken about. So awareness, I think, is the start of the problem, or identifying the problem, and then from there we have to obviously move into How do we help these children? How do we stop this? How do we prevent this? And then we've also got to look at legal action against emotional abusers. Children's Act gives the same kind of weight to emotional abuse as sexual and physical abuse, and it should be addressed by the courts. So that is also something that has to happen so that it can be highlighted and even be addressed legally.
And when we take a look at, some of these cases, who are the major culprits when it comes to this kind of abuse?
It's mostly parents or family members of patients. And so it's people that are close to the individual. That is by far the most common abuse. It happens in the families and in the homes. Now, in South Africa, where we have domestic violence, abuse against women and children in the home, children are also exposed to abuse and watching abuse, and that is a form of emotional abuse per se. So it is usually at home where these things happen.
Now, of course, these children will become part of the greater South African society. Like we said, it will have some negative impact on their adult lives. But taking a look at the bigger South African society as well, of course, that will have some ramifications for South Africa as a whole if this issue isn't addressed.
I think we can already see that. South Africa has got a very high burden of mental illness. Post-traumatic stress disorder, because we've got such a violent society, and there's hardships in South Africa, there's violence, there's domestic violence. All of this contributes to a high burden of mental illness. And we can see, through statistical analyses that South Africa is leading in some ways the incidence of mental illness already. Now, you can imagine if this continues, it'll just escalate more and more.
And what, in your opinion, can be done to stop that from escalating?
I think awareness is the first thing that should happen so that people can become aware of what is physical abuse and what are the effects of physical abuse. We do not speak about, what happens to children when they are emotionally abused. So it's important that we start addressing the whole issue of emotional abuse, start defining it as such, and define what emotional abuse is, and then also start acting against the perpetrators of such abuse.
Thank you so much. That was Eugene Allers, who is a member of the South African Society of Psychiatrists.